Myths are fascinating affairs in that they are great stories that are not actually true. But what makes myths work is that they contain inside them a truth, often a greater truth, and that's why they resonate. That's why myths persist. In other words, a myth or legend can acquire greater truth even when they're not actually true.
When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
So let's discover today classical music's 5 greatest myths to test their truth, but more importantly, to assess which has the greatest mythic power. The greater the mythic power, the more Medusas the myth schools. Starting with Salieri murdered Mozart. Let's work backwards on this one. We are essentially dealing with a film plot, a narrative of Amadeus, which comes from a play by Peter Shaffer, which comes from a one-act opera by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, Mozart and Salieri, which comes from a short play of the same name written by Pushkin in 1830. Going back from there are rumours, I repeat rumours, that at the end of his life, when he was going mad, Salieri claimed he had murdered Mozart. Rumours, I stress again. The students and doctors closest to Salieri at the time of his death explicitly deny he ever said that. And going back again even further, right to the start being Mozart's end, the composer did apparently suffer paranoid spells where he believed he was being poisoned, but Mozart never mentioned Salieri. So this really is a plotline designed predominantly by dramatists and possibly the most gossipy city in history, Vienna. It's all a bit silly really. Amadeus is a great film because of the story of jealousy, not the story of murder. I'm giving the myth a less than mythic 1 Medusa out of 5. We can do better than that, come on. The myth of the tritone states that the tritone interval was seen as diabolical by the medieval church and banned because it might raise devilish spirits.
Is it legal to play a tritone 666 times? That's how you sell your soul to the devil.
Now, the tritone is an interval which happens to come at the exact midpoint of the octave. This interval, although it sounds pretty alright to modern ears, it's essentially an augmented fourth. Yes, that bit in Maria.
Maria, I just kissed a girl named Maria.
Yes, and The Simpsons. It's harmoniously ambiguous and was avoided by medieval singers. Indeed, it acquired the nickname of the Diabolos in Musica, Latin for the devil in music, and it got that nickname probably as far back as the Middle Ages. The tritone is a note that's tricky to sing and even trickier to harmonise with. Let me, and please don't switch the video off, put it to you mathematically. Pitches sound harmonious when there's a simple ratio between their frequencies. The ratio of 2 notes an octave apart is a pleasing 2-to-1 ratio, and the next note's consonant interval is a perfect fifth, 3-to-2. So how about a tritone? Well, that gives us the wonderful ratio of 45-to-32, which, for the mathematical cognoscenti among you, is an irrational number. Which meant that early musical treatises advised avoiding the interval altogether. But was it ever banned by the church? Well, devilishly difficult does not mean the devil. There's 0 references to anything satanic in any of those early musical treatises, and nobody, church or otherwise, attempted to ban the interval. So, if people tell you you can summon the devil through the use of church-banned interval, tell them to summon a B and an S, because that's what they're talking. Having said which, the church has periodically sought to ban, or at least restrict music. Think of the Council of Trent, where an attempt was made to ban polyphonic music for masses, but that attempt failed, so there's a tiny bit of truth behind it. As a mythic score, I'm going to give this a pretty disappointing 2 Medusas out of 5, which I'm sure we can improve on and find something with greater mythic power. The Curse of the Ninth Symphony. The curse, starting of course with Beethoven, stipulates that composers will kaput after completing their 9th symphony. Franz Schubert finishes before he can complete his 10th. Spohr also only wrote 9 symphonies. Anton Bruckner finishes his 9th before, shock, he died before finishing his 10th. Dvorak also made it to 9 before, Mahler, ditto, although I've got more to say on him later. Ralph Vaughan Williams also only writes 9 before... Now, I've already made a whole video on this one, so I'll keep it relatively brief, but there are some interesting features about this myth. Firstly, there's that number 9. Number 9 is a powerful number. It's a reset number, and that's because we humans count in base 10, because we have 10 fingers, so we reset every 10th number. If we had 8 fingers, we'd probably have had the curse of the 7th symphony. What's fascinating about this is how people's own personal superstitions can give these myths more power, and Mahler is the perfect example. And I have to say, I love the way contemporary satirists painted the sweat beads on him. It says a lot. You see, he was highly superstitious and neurotic and hated the number 9. He believed the curse, so when he came to write his 9th symphony, he called it Das Lied von Erde instead. He then went on to write his 10th symphony. This was described now as his 9th symphony, and then, assuming he had escaped the curse through his devious trickery, proceeded on symphony number 10, only to die. So the myth stuck. And Mahler's own superstitions are a good reason why. If he had just named Das Lied von Erde as his 9th symphony, he would have finished his 10th symphony before dying. But anyway, it's a myth with power. The first on this list with proper mythic power, which is why I'm giving the Curse of the Ninth a slightly more legendary 3 Medusas out of 5. Mozart was buried in a pauper's grave. Now, it's true we don't know where Wolfgang Mozart is actually buried, but the idea that he was tipped into a pit full of unknown peasants is at least highly exaggerated. It turns out that in fact Mozart was buried in a common grave. This is not a pauper's grave, and it's not a mass grave. Common graves usually interred 3 to 5 bodies alongside one another. You have to remember that even in the 18th century, Vienna was a very crowded city. Emperor Joseph II had instituted sanitary laws that forbade ornate mausoleums for ordinary middle-class citizens like Mozart. So Mozart was buried in a common grave, and the site was reused probably around 10 years after his death, which means we don't know exactly where Mozart was buried and which bit of his bodies we have or we don't have. But this isn't because he was being treated as a pauper. He was just being treated as an ordinary citizen of Vienna. However, there is something enticing about this myth, and you can hear why in that last sentence. Mozart being treated like an ordinary citizen. There is the rather convincing idea here that Mozart was underappreciated, not just in death, but also during his life. Mozart himself felt this, knowing he served in a royal household at the same level as a butler, and that was something he commented himself bitterly in letters to his father when he was in the service of the Archbishop Colloredo. Now, I've made a video about this if you want to check that out, but the big takeout is that Mozart deserved a mausoleum and not just a cenotaph. Yes, he was being treated as an ordinary citizen and not a pauper, but that is still shocking. This is a myth with power. I'm giving it 4 Medusas out of 5. Okay, time to find out classical music's greatest myth. Everyone knows this myth, that the 1913 premiere of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring caused a riot in the audience. Actually, no. The premiere was chaotic, and people did argue loudly. Some loved it, some hated it, but it wasn't the full-blown fistfight history has made it out to be. This is not to downplay the event and what happened. It was apparently very chaotic, there was arguing, and a seat cushion or two may have been thrown. However, the idea that there was a full-blown riot is a huge exaggeration of mythic proportions. Exaggeration caused immediately afterwards by sensationalism in the French press, and then by the BS ability of dancing promoter Diaghilev, who encouraged the sense of scandal about the premiere, knowing it would build mystique about his production. Constant retellings have elevated the exaggerations into mythic status, but a myth it remains. And its mythic power? Well, you've really got to appreciate the mythos behind the logos here. Firstly, we have the idea of the clash of modernism against crusty 19th century thinking. The arguments in the theatre reflected a greater truth, a greater argument taking place outside the theatre doors. The argument between older, more harmonious music and the new discordant sound that modernism was ushering in. And that's especially true when you consider the timing. 1913, just before the start of the Great War. The idea that civilized humans are in fact sacrificial primitives is one that would have much more traction after World War I and indeed World War II. Which means the idea that civilized audience might behave like animals contains an irresistible irony. Stravinsky's music and the calamitous events of the first half of the 20th century draws attention to the animal in our souls. It's a narrative that's hard to resist. I'm giving this a perfect, legendary 5 Medusas out of 5. Okay, that's it. Am I wrong? Have I missed an even greater myth? Do let me know in the comment section. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe.